Something massive is shifting right now, and most people have no idea what it actually means. When the word military action gets attached to Iran and the name Trump in the same sentence, the media machine kicks into overdrive. Panic headlines, partisan noise, talking heads filling airtime with everything except the truth. But here's what they won't tell you. This isn't a sudden decision. This is the visible surface of a geopolitical pressure campaign that has been building for years, rooted in oil choke points, petrodollar architecture, proxy warfare in Yemen and Gaza, and Iran's accelerating nuclear timeline that has quietly crossed thresholds Western intelligence agencies refuse to announce publicly. The Persian Gulf isn't just geography, it's the artery through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply moves. Any military escalation there doesn't stay regional. It reprices energy globally, reshuffles alliance structures, and forces every major power, China, Russia, the EU, to choose a side openly or quietly. What Trump is weighing right now isn't simply a military strike. It's a civilizational chess move on a board that's already mid-game. Stay with me, because the next few minutes will change how you read every headline you see after this. Let me take you back, not to 3 minutes ago, but to the architecture of a conflict that was never really about nuclear weapons in the first place. Because if you want to understand what is happening right now with Trump and Iran, you have to understand the deeper story. And that story starts with power. Who has it? Who is losing it? And who is desperately trying to hold on to it before the window closes forever. Iran is not simply a rogue state that woke up one morning and decided it wanted nuclear weapons to cause chaos. That is the simplified version designed for people who consume news in 30-second clips. The real version is far more layered. Iran sits at the intersection of some of the most strategically valuable geography on the planet. It controls or significantly influences access to the Strait of Hormuz. It has deep cultural, religious, and political reach into Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. And for decades, it has been the one major regional power that Washington was never fully able to domesticate, buy off, or neutralize. That fact alone makes it dangerous to a certain kind of global order. The kind of order that was constructed after World War II and reinforced after the Cold War, with American military and financial dominance at its center. Now, here is where it gets interesting. That order, the one built on dollar hegemony, on NATO expansion, on the IMF and World Bank as instruments of soft control, that order is visibly fracturing, and the people who built it and who benefit most from it are watching the fractures spread in real time. BRICS is expanding. Saudi Arabia, which was the crown jewel of petrodollar recycling, is now openly conducting oil trades in currencies other than the dollar. China and Russia have been systematically insulating their economies from dollar-based sanctions. And Iran, which has been living under the most severe sanctions architecture the United States ever constructed, has not collapsed. In fact, it has deepened its relationships with Beijing and Moscow precisely because Washington's pressure campaign gave it no other choice. So, when you hear that Trump is considering military action against Iran, you have to ask yourself the honest question. What is the actual strategic goal? Because the stated reason and the real reason are almost never the same thing in geopolitics. The stated reason will be nuclear enrichment, or regional destabilization, or support for proxy forces, and those things are real. Iran is enriching uranium at levels that are deeply concerning, and it does support Hezbollah and the Houthis and various armed factions across the region. Those facts are not in dispute, but the question underneath the question is this: would a military strike solve any of those problems, or would it accelerate every single one of them? Let's think through that honestly, because this is where the analysis has to be rigorous and not emotional. If the United States or Israel, with American backing, were to conduct a serious military campaign against Iran's nuclear facilities, what happens next? First, those facilities are not all above ground. The Fordo enrichment facility is buried deep inside a mountain. It was specifically designed to survive conventional airstrikes. Destroying it would require either a sustained campaign of bunker-busting munitions or, in the extreme scenarios that serious military planners discuss behind closed doors, something far more consequential. Even in the optimistic military scenario, where the strikes degrade Iran's nuclear program significantly, you are looking at a delay of perhaps 2 to 5 years, not elimination. A delay, and in the meantime, you have set the entire region on fire. Because Iran does not sit passively and absorb strikes, it has spent the last 2 decades building a regional deterrence architecture specifically designed for this scenario. Hezbollah in Lebanon has an arsenal of over 150,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel. The Houthis in Yemen have already demonstrated in the last year and a half that they can threaten commercial shipping across the Red Sea and strike deep into Israel with ballistic missiles and drones. Iraqi militia groups aligned with Tehran have the ability to strike American bases throughout the region with precision, and Iran's own missile program, which has been tested in live combat already, is sophisticated enough to threaten every American military installation in the Middle East. This is not a paper deterrent, this is a real and tested capability, and any serious military planner inside the Pentagon knows that. So then, why is the conversation about military action happening at all? This is the question that the mainstream coverage will never adequately answer, because answering it honestly would require admitting things about how American foreign policy actually works that are uncomfortable for the institutions that produce that coverage. The honest answer is that the conversation about military action against Iran has never gone away. It has been circulating in think tanks and in certain corners of the national security establishment for over 20 years. The people who wanted to strike Iran after the Iraq War never stopped wanting to strike Iran. They just had to wait for the right political alignment, the right pretext, and the right moment of domestic distraction to make it feel inevitable. And here is something worth sitting with. Trump, in his first term, came closer to a major conflict with Iran than almost any administration in recent history. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani in January 2020 was not a small event. Soleimani was the architect of Iran's entire regional strategy. Killing him was an act of war by any serious definition of that term. Iran's response, ballistic missile strikes on American bases in Iraq, caused traumatic brain injuries in over 100 American service members, something the Pentagon initially tried to downplay as headaches. The fact that that moment did not spiral into a full regional war was partly luck, partly back-channel diplomacy, and partly the fact that neither side was fully prepared to absorb the consequences of full-scale conflict at that particular moment. But the logic of escalation was not resolved, it was only deferred. Now we are in a second Trump term, and the variables have shifted in significant ways. Iran's nuclear program is further advanced than it was in 2020. The Abraham Accords have reshaped the regional alliance landscape. Israel, under Netanyahu's government, is in a posture of maximum assertiveness after the Gaza campaign. And Trump himself, in this second term, is operating with a political configuration that gives him more latitude than he had in the first. His base will not punish him for projecting strength against Iran. In fact, a segment of his coalition, particularly those aligned with a certain vision of Christian Zionism and Israeli security, will actively celebrate it. But here is what almost nobody in the mainstream conversation is saying clearly. A military conflict with Iran in 2025 or 2026 would not look like the wars in Iraq or Libya. It would not be a quick decapitation strike followed by regime collapse and reconstruction. Iran is a country of 90 million people with a sophisticated military, an entrenched ideological commitment to resistance, and a deep network of regional allies who would all activate simultaneously. You would not be fighting Iran alone. You would be fighting a coalition that stretches from Beirut to Baghdad to Sana'a to Tehran, and you would be doing it in a global economic environment where any serious disruption to Gulf oil flows would send energy prices to levels that the American middle class, already stretched thin, would feel immediately and painfully at every gas station and in every utility bill. And then there is the China dimension, which the coverage consistently underweights. China imports enormous quantities of Iranian oil. China has signed a 25-year strategic partnership agreement with Iran. If the United States conducts a military campaign against Iran, and that campaign disrupts Chinese energy supply chains or threatens Chinese economic interests in the region, you are no longer looking at a bilateral confrontation. You are looking at a situation with the potential to involve the two largest economies on the planet on opposite sides of a conflict in the world's most energy-critical geography. That is not a scenario that ends cleanly or predictably. Russia's position is equally significant. Russia has been a consistent diplomatic shield for Iran at the United Nations Security Council. Russia and Iran have been deepening their military and economic cooperation throughout the Ukraine conflict period. Any American military action against Iran would be read in Moscow not merely as a regional move, but as a signal about Washington's willingness to use military force to discipline countries that have aligned themselves with the emerging non-Western economic architecture. That reading would have consequences that extend well beyond the Middle East. Now I want to be fair to the other side of the argument, because serious analysis requires that. There are people with genuine strategic credentials who argue that the window to prevent Iran from achieving full nuclear weapons capability is closing, and that once Iran crosses that threshold, the entire regional security architecture changes in ways that are very difficult to reverse. They argue that a nuclear-armed Iran would trigger Saudi Arabia and Turkey and potentially Egypt to pursue their own nuclear programs, leading to the most dangerous proliferation scenario in the history of the Middle East. They argue that the costs of inaction, measured over decades, could exceed the costs of military action now. These are not crazy arguments. They reflect real strategic dilemmas that serious people have wrestled with for years. But the response to that argument has to be honest about what military action can actually achieve versus what it claims to achieve. If the goal is to permanently eliminate Iran's nuclear capability, military action cannot deliver that goal. It can only delay it, and the delay comes at a cost in regional stability, in American military resources, in global economic disruption, and in the moral credibility of a country that would be conducting its third major military intervention in the Middle East in 25 years. At some point, the pattern itself becomes the message, and the message it sends to every other country watching is, develop your deterrent as fast as possible, because conventional diplomacy with Washington has an expiration date. There is also a domestic American dimension to this that deserves serious attention. The United States in 2025 is not the same country it was in 2003 when the Iraq War was launched. Public appetite for military adventure in the Middle East is genuinely low. The veterans community, which carries enormous moral weight in American political culture, is deeply skeptical of another prolonged engagement. The economic conditions that would follow an oil price shock are not politically sustainable for any administration, and the institutional memory of what happened after Iraq and after Libya, when the celebrated military victories turned into decade-long catastrophes, is still very much alive in the American consciousness. Trump, whatever you think of him, has always had a somewhat contradictory relationship with military intervention. He campaigned in 2016 on ending endless wars, he pulled troops from Syria, he negotiated with the Taliban, and yet he also assassinated Soleimani. He maintains deep relationships with Israeli leadership, and his administration is populated with people whose foreign policy instincts lean toward maximum pressure and military deterrence. The tension inside his own coalition on this issue is real, and it is one of the reasons that considering military action is a phrase that can mean many different things depending on who is using it and in what context. What it almost certainly means right now is pressure. Maximum pressure diplomacy, which is Trump's preferred instrument, uses the credible threat of military action to extract negotiating concessions. The goal, at least in the stated framework, is to bring Iran back to a nuclear agreement on terms more favorable to Washington and its regional allies than the original JCPOA that Obama negotiated and Trump abandoned in 2018. Whether that strategy can work is a separate question. Iran's leadership has watched what happened to countries that made concessions to Washington, Libya being the most instructive example, and they have drawn conclusions that make full denuclearization extremely unlikely, unless the security guarantees offered are ironclad in ways that American political institutions are structurally incapable of providing, given that any agreement can be abandoned by the next administration. And so we arrive at the place where the real analysis has to land. This is not a crisis with a clean solution. It is a confrontation between an established power that is slowly losing the ability to enforce its global order and a regional power that has made a strategic decision to resist incorporation into that order regardless of the cost. The nuclear program is real, but it is also a symbol of something larger. The refusal to be absorbed, controlled, or eliminated. Understanding that doesn't mean endorsing it, it means seeing it clearly, and seeing it clearly is the only way to honestly assess what military action would accomplish, what it would cost, and whether the people making these decisions have fully reckoned with the difference between what they intend and what they will actually produce. The next weeks and months will tell us a great deal about where this goes. Watch the diplomatic back channels, not just the headlines. Watch what Oman does, because Oman has historically been the quiet conduit for US-Iran communication. Watch what China signals through its foreign ministry statements. Watch whether European governments, which are desperately trying to preserve some version of the nuclear framework, are being consulted or merely informed. Watch the oil price, because the market is a more honest analyst than most commentators. And watch Trump himself. Not what he says publicly, but what his administration does quietly in the spaces between the announcements. Because in geopolitics, the real story is almost never the one being loudly told. It is the one unfolding in the background while everyone is looking at the noise. And right now, the noise is very loud, which usually means the background is where everything important is actually happening.